While the Chancellor was out talking up her budget around the country, the gilt markets were casting their own judgment on her handiwork, pushing up the cost of government borrowing. They'd heard the man who signs off the government's budget for accuracy question whether yesterday's giant tax haul really was the last one we'd see in this Parliament.
On the spending side, clearly a big injection of resources into the health service and other public services over the next few years. But then still quite a lot of unanswered questions about what happens over the rest of the Parliament.
People wait for your judgment from on high.
They do, and I think it is because we are very careful with what we've done.
Less coded, the man whose verdict governments wait in trepidation for. Paul Johnson's run the Institute for Fiscal Studies for 13 years. This was the last budget he'll judge in that post.
You called out the previous government for what you thought were incredible, implausible spending plans. How would you describe these ones once you get out of year one, year two?
These are pretty unlikely. I mean, it's just about possible, I suppose, that by increasing the baseline, increasing what we're spending this year and next by a fair bit, everything will be hunky-dory and then they won't need any more increases. But I think that's, a pretty small probability of that.
My first budget as Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the first budget ever delivered by a woman Chancellor of the Exchequer, and that was a huge privilege to be able to do that.
After this trip to Coventry, Rachel Reeves made a point of giving Bloomberg an interview, inevitably watched closely by those who buy government debt.
We've seen such a ferocious gilt sell-off. It's spreading now to stocks and sterling. Are you worried that we're heading for a Liz Truss situation?
The number one commitment of this government is economic and fiscal stability.
At the heart of the questions being asked about this budget is how far will the giant dollops of extra spending announced yesterday actually satisfy the giant needs of the NHS in particular?
It's certainly not a step change that will lead to rapidly reducing waiting times for care or rapid improvements in the quality of care or us suddenly seeing new hospitals springing up around us. This is the sort of funding package that I think can lead to some gradual improvements, some improvements in certain services, but it's nowhere close to what we saw 25 years ago when NHS funding was being turbocharged.
Party leaders were criticised throughout the election campaign for not telling voters the true state of the public finances.
I mean, got bored hearing ourselves saying, that there was a problem here. Politicians are scared of us, the electorate. They're scared to lay it on the line about the need for taxes if you want higher spending, or indeed the need to cut back on the welfare state provision.
Paul Johnson suspects low household income growth is driving a lot in our politics. A decade after the Second World War, household incomes started to grow and bobbed around 2 to 3% growth before slumping after the banking crisis. That near stagnation in household income, the OBR now forecasts, could continue right through this Parliament.
You had the 1980s when inequality was rising dramatically. We had high levels of unemployment. But the person in the middle, the average person, was doing really pretty well and getting better off. And that drove a very different politics to the politics we've had over the last 15 or even 20 years when actually inequality has fallen, but the person in the middle has been doing really badly.
And then we'll have sheep come on and eat these oats off.
Farmers have been amongst the most prominent campaigners to reject budget measures. They want to stop the move to limit inheritance tax relief for farms to £1 million.
This is a small family farm. It's 165 acres. It may be very valuable on the balance sheet, but the profit derived from that is very low and it doesn't generate enough income to look at how we'd pay that inheritance tax.
Farmers, one of many groups pushing back against budget decisions, which the government insists it couldn't have known until coming to power, were necessary on such a giant scale.
Gary Gibbon reporting there. Well, now, the American political strategist James Carville once said, "I used to want to be reincarnated as a president or pope, but now I want to come back as the bond market. You can intimidate anyone." Well, there is not a reaction like there was after the Liz Truss mini-budget 2 years ago. The gnomes of Zurich are not delivering a punished beating to the punishment beating to the British government now as they did then, but they have hoved uncomfortably into view with the cost of government borrowing rising. And our economics correspondent Helia Ebrahimi is here with more. Helia.
Kathy, I love that quote. What it's saying is that the bond market is a completely unforgiving beast. But I'm not quite sure we're at bond vigilante territory. Yes, there's been a big market reaction, there's been a sell-off, and that's really embarrassing for a government that's swept to power on the back of saying they're going to restore stability on the back of Liz Truss. If we take a look at the 10-year gilts, you can see that it's been climbing and climbing and climbing ever since Rachel Reeves stood at the dispatch box. Earlier today, it hit a one-year high. Now, economists think there's only going to be one interest rate cut this year instead of two. But bond traders that I talk to say there are other factors at work as well. And it's important to remember that while this increase has been steep, it's less than a quarter of what we saw under Liz Truss. But of course, Kathy, it is bad because it adds to our borrowing costs. And if we take a look at how that has looked all the way back to the 2000s when borrowing was cheap, it rose hugely when we borrowed for COVID, we borrowed for the energy crisis. And Rachel Reeves says it is coming down, but the IFS says borrowing will now cost us £100 billion a year, and that this budget alone has added £10 billion. Interest rate expectations leading to the budget, another £3 billion. And of course, you've got the rise that we've seen in the last 24 hours. So all of that is a nasty combination.
A lot of billions there. So what about Labour's central tax-raising strategy in this budget? What have you learned about that today?
Well, the national insurance increase in employer contributions, well, that saw rates going up from 13.8% to 15%, but it's also the cut to the threshold at the bottom end from 9,000 to 5,000, which means that this hit falls disproportionately on those who are earning the least. For example, if you are earning something in the region of £22,000, you will have, in relative terms, the biggest impact at a cost of £770. Now, as Gary's piece was saying, the government's line is this is not going to impact workers, but let's have a look at what the OBR says. OBR says, well, actually, wages will be hit 61%, prices to consumers will cost 15%, and corporate profits, well, they will also take a hit at 24%. And I think the bigger issue that we've learned from today is that the IFS says that £25 billion that the government says it's going to raise, well, we don't even think it's going to raise that, because if you have lower employment and lower wages, there'll be a hit to all sorts of other taxes. They say it'll look more like something like £16 billion. And if you add on to that the money that is going to be there to support public service employers like the NHS, you're looking at something much closer to £10 billion. So all of this is going to really nick away at the Chancellor's credibility, but most importantly will be the market reaction.
Lots of questions for the Chancellor. Thanks, Helia. Well, earlier I went to the Treasury to interview Rachel Reeves and began by asking her whether she was worried about the market's reaction to her budget. Chancellor, the bond markets have given their verdict on your budget. UK borrowing costs have risen to their highest levels this year. I mean, that's obviously bad news for people with mortgages, but also you, because you're the biggest borrower of them all. Are you a bit worried about that?
Well, look, markets will move on any given day, but we have now put our public finances on a firm footing with robust fiscal rules, which the Office of Budget Responsibility confirmed yesterday that we will meet after 3 years, 2 years earlier than planned. And the International Monetary Fund yesterday gave our budget a clean bill of health, said that it was the right decisions in terms of the fiscal consolidation that we have built into that budget and the measures we are taking to reduce the deficit.
Well, you haven't mentioned the IFS. They've given their verdict, they always do the day after a budget. They've accused you of playing what they call silly games because you've penciled in implausibly low spending increases, as they put it, so 1.3% year after next, for example. And that implies, doesn't it, that you're going to have to come back and ask for yet more tax rises?
Absolutely not. We have now set the envelope of spending for this Parliament, and we're going to live within our means.
Right, so no more tax rises. You can say that loud and clear.
No Chancellor can bind their hands in that way, not knowing what is going to happen in the global economy, for example, over the next 5 years. But I can say that we have now drawn a line under the fiscal fiction of the previous government. We have wiped the slate clean, and we have undone the damage that the previous government have done. And that can give confidence to investors in the UK economy that we have taken the action necessary with robust fiscal rules, tough spending plans, a zero-based review to make sure we get value for money for every pound of government money spent. And we did have to make tax rises yesterday, but those tax rises were necessary to get our public finances back on a firm footing.
You say that's it, but I wonder whether people will trust you, because if you look in the election campaign in May, you said, and I quote, "There are no additional tax rises needed beyond the ones that I've said." I mean, people might think, well, you were dishonest then and you're being dishonest now.
And there was a £22 billion black hole in the public finances. And beyond that, and we published yesterday a line-by-line breakdown of hundreds of unfunded commitments from the previous government. Now, I could have swept that under the carpet and say, well, I'll deal with that another day, but that would have continued the dishonesty of the previous government. We have now wiped the slate clean.
£22 billion.
Well, that's what we inherited.
It's heavily disputed. Ultimately, you've made a political choice, haven't you? And one of those choices is to raise employers' national insurance. Now, this morning, you've accepted that this will end up, the bill will be footed by employees, it will be footed by workers.
Well, it will be shared. Now the alternative was,
well, Kathy,
but the alternative was increasing income tax and national insurance directly on working people. The measure that we've taken means that at least some of that will be absorbed by employers, and we have the floor of the national living wage and national minimum wage, which people can't fall below, and we've also carved out for the smallest businesses an exemption, which means that you can employ the equivalent of 4 people at the national living wage.
You kept saying to people workers wouldn't foot the bill, and they are. That was a pretence, wasn't it? That was a fiction.
Kathy, I made a commitment in our manifesto not to increase the key taxes that working people pay: national insurance, income tax and VAT, and we stuck by those commitments even in very difficult fiscal circumstances in the budget yesterday.
But there were other choices. There were other choices. You could have cut the welfare bill, for example.
We've cut the welfare bill
back to how it was before COVID.
Kathy, we've cut the welfare bill by £4.3 billion by cutting down on fraud and error. That is the biggest ever fraud and error scoring by the Office of Budget Responsibility.
But it's tiny compared to the tax rises. No, that's my point. 40 billion tax rises.
It's £4.3 billion that no government has ever set out to deliver before. But yesterday we brought stability back to our economy with a tough set of fiscal rules, some difficult choices on tax, welfare and spending, but our public finances are now on a solid trajectory. We've set out our public spending plans for the rest of this Parliament. We've put more money into the National Health Service, and we're beginning to rebuild our country.
Can you give farmers any hope that you'll listen to their concerns on inheritance tax, that you might have a rethink on that?
On top of the normal inheritance tax thresholds that you can pass on if you're a couple of £1 million, including a house, to your descendants. In addition, agricultural property relief will now provide another £1 million of tax-free allowance. And then above that, there is a 50% discount on inheritance tax compared with what everyone else pays. And indeed, 73% of agricultural property reliefs don't exceed £1 million. So small farmers won't be affected at all.
Yeah, but a lot of family farms say they will be affected. I just
wonder,
will you listen to their concerns?
We've got to raise money. I feel we've done that in a fair and balanced way, but 73% of farmers won't be paying a single penny more in inheritance tax.
And the reason for all this tax rise pain is partly because you need to pour more money into the NHS. In return for your largesse, have you had any guarantees from them, for example, about meeting that target you've got, reducing waiting times to 18 weeks? Have you got a guarantee from them on?
First of all, a target which we've agreed with the National Health Service of 2% efficiency and productivity improvements this year and next. And in addition to that, a commitment to deliver the 40,000 additional appointments every single week in the NHS. And we will deliver that within the first year of this Labour government and make progress towards that 18-week commitment.
Yeah,
between a referral.
When can you meet that?
Well, we'll make progress in this first year, but certainly in this first year. 40,000 additional appointments every single week. That was our manifesto commitment. We will deliver it in our first year.
The NHS are saying it won't be until the end of the Parliament before they can reach that target. Is that acceptable? You want them to go faster?
We want to go further, we want to go faster. But what I can commit today, because of the money that we've put in, there will be 40,000 additional appointments every single week. That means people at home today who are waiting for an operation, for an appointment, for a procedure, will get it sooner than if we hadn't have put that money in.
Rachel Reeves, Chancellor, thank you very much.
Thank you.